Our next presenter is someone who many of you will have read his work and be well aware of the enormous work that he's done in this space over many years, and that is David Spratt, the Research Director for Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. David's presentation is entitled Beyond Urgent, the Science of Climate Warming as Existential Risk. I think you can't get much better than a presentation title like that. Please give a huge welcome to David Spratt.
Thanks. It's great to see so many people here. I've been given the task of talking about the science of the climate emergency. I know most of this conference we're talking about paths and solutions, so I've got 20 minutes to describe the problem in toto. So we're going to whip through this fairly quickly. So I'm going to do look at three things. Some science of what's happened so far, the science of where we're going, and some science of the solution. So it's going to be in three parts. So let's start moving. So where have we got to? Carbon dioxide emissions are going up. They've gone up 50% in the last 20 years. And if you look historically at the... this is not good. We've missed something. If we look at carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and track them against the conferences and the IPCC reports, we can see a fairly compelling story of them continuing to go up. And if you look at the level of carbon dioxide in the air now, it is roughly 40% higher than it has been at any time in the last million years. That is, we are creating conditions that humans, modern humans, have never before experienced. Don't worry about this, all the colours so much. These are emission reduction rates to get back to 2 degrees, which is not a safe target, but it demonstrates one thing very clearly. If we had started in 1995 reducing emissions, the rate of emissions reduction would have been 0.4 of a billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. Because we haven't done that, and we'd be lucky to peak in 2020, the rate becomes 2.4 billion tonnes a year. That is, a delay of 20 years has made our task 6 times more difficult. And the more we delay, the more challenging that becomes. So that, in a sense, was the opportunity lost. And lastly, the temperature in the atmosphere, compared to the late 19th century, we're now about 1.1 degrees warmer than we were when we started this process. In fact, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you can probably add on about another 0.2, so actually about 1.3 above when we started using coal. Let's go on. 2 markers before I talk about some impacts. The first is the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, which is voluntary, unenforceable commitments, those commitments at the moment, if nothing more was done, would lead the world to 3.4 degrees of warming. But that figure does not account for the fact that we are now starting to mobilise carbon cycle feedbacks, systems of climate that start to kick in and add to warming. If those feedbacks are included, we actually get to 5 degrees. So understand that where we are now with the Paris commitments, we are on the path to 3 to 5 degrees of warming unless more is done at an international level. The second thing I want to talk about is this word existential. Risk can be understood in scope as from personal, local, or global, endurable, or terminal. So it can be personally terminal, as in death. When you get a thing that is both global and terminal, it is called an existential risk. It's a field of growing analysis, and an existential risk, as this definition shows, is a risk posing permanent large negative consequences to humanity which can never be undone. And I think the evidence I will present today leads to the conclusion that we are now in the space, by the end of this century, we as a species may be facing existential risk. Certainly for many countries and many peoples, if not for humanity as a whole. So I want to start 1.1 degrees, which is the warming we have now, and I'm going to work up through some numbers till we get up to Paris, so you understand the impacts as we become warmer. You know what happened in the Barrier Reef 2 years ago? When coral bleaches, it takes 10 to 15 years to recover if it is severely bleached. And some researchers at Melbourne University did some work, and they said, just for the current level of warming, for 1.1 degrees, how often can we expect another bleaching event? And their answer was this number here, 31%. There's a 31% chance of the coral sea being as warm in any year as it was in 2016. That is a 1 in 3 chance. So on average, the reef will bleach 1 year in 3 from now on. If we get to 1.5 degrees of warming, it actually becomes 64%. That is a 2 in 3. Thank you. A 2 in 3 year chance. Now, when it takes 15 years to recover and it's going to bleach 2 years in 3, we're obviously in a death cycle in terms of coral systems. So this is simply to say that while people talk about 1.5 to 2 degrees as being reasonable warming targets, in terms of the barrier reef and many other systems, they are not safe. 1.5 is not safe. 1.1 is not safe for the barrier reef. The same is true of the Arctic. This is where I started writing about climate many years ago. And we can see in the Arctic system now fundamental changes. The volume of sea ice, the ice on the surface of the water that fluxes with summer and winter, is now down to 1/3 the volume it was 20 years ago. There are expectations that we will actually have a summer when there'll be no sea ice within the next decade or two. And that will have profound consequences for the rest of the Arctic system, particularly for Greenland. Because when white ice, which reflects heat, is replaced by dark blue water, which absorbs heat, then the whole system becomes much warmer. Let's go on. I think there have been 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years where science has come out and scientists have been really rocked by what they saw. One was in 2007 with the big melt in the Arctic, where one scientist said it's melting 100 years ahead of schedule, which was 100 years of the science. A second event happened in 2014 when some scientists produced some work for the West Antarctic ice sheet, and it really sent a rip around the scientific community, which I hadn't seen since 2007. And in 2014, those scientists said, just for the way the climate system is now, that is, without adding in more greenhouse gases, without perturbing it any further, some of those West Antarctic glaciers will melt and disappear. That is, the West Antarctic ice sheet has actually passed its tipping point. And Philip Sutton and I asked one of the authors when they thought that had actually happened, because it was an event, a tipping point already occurred, and they said 20 or 30 years ago, when warming was about 0.5. So this is why 1.1 is not safe. So let's now go to 1.5 degrees, the lower range of the Paris theory. Permafrost melting of frozen earth and subsea systems in the Arctic is not included in any of the work of the IPCC. Yet these events are already occurring. They're not yet to the point of system change, but they are already active. And there is research which suggests that in another decade from now, the Arctic, rather than being a store of carbon, will actually become a source of carbon. That is, the system will flip from one state to another. So if we look at 1.5 degrees, we can see that there are already, by 1.5 degrees, there are fundamental shifts in various climate systems: coral reefs, the Arctic, the Antarctic, permafrost, Greenland. It's likely only a decade away. Melbourne University researchers have said that they expect us to get to 1.5 between 2028 and 2034. So 1.5 is not some far away goal or idea. It's actually a decade from now. The third thing is, despite the IPCC report, which is going to come out in 2 months, about 1.5 degrees, which in my humble opinion, and some scientists who have seen it, is a political fix. That is, some things have been bent to suit political circumstance. There is no carbon budget left for 1.5. If we just let the system go, didn't put any more carbon dioxide up there, we would get past 1.5. 0.5 degrees is safe. James Hansen, the greatest climate scientist in the world, the man who in 1988 first testified at the US Congress, says 1.5 is not an appropriate goal. Is not an appropriate goal. And an appropriate temperature is to return to the Holocene range, the range of human civilisation, which is 0.5 or less. We know that under 0.5 would be safe for coral reefs, safe for the Arctic or safe for the Antarctic. So this must be our goal. Let's now go, we've done 1.1, 1.5, let's go to 2 degrees. At 2 degrees, in the long run, and this is really important, in the long run, sea levels will rise 10 to 20 metres for every 1 degree of warming. We think about 1 or 2 degrees. It takes time to get through, but in the long run, historically, you get 10 to 20 metres for every degree. So for the current warming, if we just stayed at 1.1, in 500 to 1,000 years, the sea levels would be up 10 or 20 metres. So that's what we've done so far. The Pentagon uses 1 and 2 metre scenarios to the end of this century to test their naval facilities against. In Australia, we're at about 0.8 or 1.4. So the Pentagon is actually much more progressive on this system than any government in Australia. A 1 metre sea level rise would inundate about half of the Mekong Valley, which is the food source for Vietnam. It would inundate 1/3 of the Nile, and it would flood 20% of Bangladesh and displace 30 million people. So these are very serious consequences that we have already put into the system. This is the world's first climate fence. It is built by the Indian government and surrounds Bangladesh. 7,000 kilometres of fence permanently manned, personed by 70,000 Indian troops, to stop people who will be displaced from climate change reaching safety on land. This is where we are heading. If we look at 2 degrees of warming, this is Disaster Alley, our part of the world, Asia. The smaller red circles are the proportions of population that will be affected by a 2-degree warming. And you look at places like Hong Kong, 31%, Shanghai, 40%, Calcutta, 24%, and so on, Mumbai, 40%. So it's not the 5, 10, 20 metres of sea level rise that will cause the damage. It's actually the first few metres that are already in the system. A month ago, a paper came out called Hothouse Earth, the most downloaded paper in the history of science publication. I'm sure most of you saw it on the media, where some eminent climate scientists, including Will Steffen from the Climate Council, said that if we get to around 2 degrees of warming, positive feedbacks, systems that keep on warming, may take the planet beyond our capacity to haul climate change back down. As they said, a cascade of feedbacks could push the system irreversibly onto a much hotter pathway. This is Melbourne. I'll get on this side. This is Melbourne with a 2 metre sea level rise and a 1 metre storm surge. So this is what I think Melbourne will look like at the end of this century. So the current level of greenhouse gases, in summary, are enough for more than 2 degrees of warming. There's no carbon budget for a 2-degree target, and from James Hansen's point of view, and I think from the evidence I presented, 2 degrees of warming is actually a prescription for disaster. Here's an effect of 3 degrees of warming on crop yields. And if we draw a line from 40 degrees south to 40 degrees north, inside that circle you can see the only place where crop yields will improve is the Tibetan Plateau, because the ice will be melting. But for the rest, for Australia, for Asia, for Africa and South America, the crop yields will be down in the range 20 to 40%. At 3 degrees also, you start to get into really severe problems with international relations, with the stability of the system. In 2007, some very senior American national security people did a scenario and they asked a question: what would the world look like if you got 3 degrees of warming and 0.5 metre of sea level rise, which are both really feasible for where we're going? And here's their answer, and it's really pretty stunning. In this scenario, nations around the world will be overwhelmed by the scale of change and the pernicious challenges, such as pandemic disease. The internal cohesion of nations will be under great stress, including in the United States, both as a result of a dramatic rise in migration and changes in agricultural patterns and water availability. And then they concluded as follows: in these circumstances, 3 degrees and just 0.5 metre sea level rise, the flooding of coastal communities around the world has the potential to challenge regional and even national identities, as we know in the Pacific, for example. Armed conflict between nations over resources such as the Nile and its tributaries is likely, and nuclear war is possible. Social consequences range from increased religious fervour to outright chaos. Climate change provokes a permanent shift in the relationship of humankind to nature. So that is conservative American national security analysts talking about what 3 degrees means. There's a whole lot of work being done now about what climate extremes mean, particularly where you get climates that are sufficiently hot and wet that you can't survive outside an air conditioner, when a wet bulb temperature gets above about 35 degrees. And there's work being published in the last year, for example, that shows that if you get to 4 degrees of warming, remembering that Paris is 3 to 5, so this is in the middle of the Paris range, 3/4 of the world's population would be subject to heat each year, which they could not survive outside of air-conditioned circumstances. This is the likelihood of temperatures at 4 degree risks. And this is Australia. And the conclusion is that if we get to 4 degrees of warming, most of Australia can experience extremes of more than 50 degrees. Now remember that Black Saturday was 47. So it's Black Saturday plus 3. And the man who did this work says that in the most highly populated regions, if we get to 4 degrees, there's a 10 to 30% chance of heat waves greater than 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 54.4 degrees Celsius, which is clearly unlivable. Let's go on. And lastly, scientists say formally and informally, particularly over a cup of tea or a drink, that 4 degrees is not compatible with the maintenance of human civilisation. A few brave ones have said it in a written form, but this is, I think, well understood, and they even worry about 3 degrees. Even the World Bank said there's no certainty that we can adapt to 4 degrees, and the world's most politically connected climate scientist, Professor Schellenhuber, said 10 years ago that if we got to 4 degrees, we might have a billion people left on the planet. So let's just summarise. This is the one slide. This is the only slide we actually need. 0.5 is safe. 1 is already dangerous. 1.5 means more significant tipping points. 2 degrees is Hothouse Earth. 3 degrees is outright chaos. And 4 degrees is incompatible with the maintenance of human civilisation, just to go up through the numbers. The Paris outcome is presently 3 to 5 degrees. Everyone can take a photo of this slide. It's the only one you need, honestly. And just for a historical example, the last time carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was similar to today's levels during the Pliocene 3 or 4 million years ago, temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees above the pre-industrial level, and the sea levels are about 25 metres. So the present amount of carbon dioxide is enough to create civilisation-ending conditions. Okay, we're now going to do a little bit of part 3, which is some science of the response, very quickly in half a dozen slides. This is energy intensity. Whoops, we missed that one. Come back. Thank you. This is energy intensity over the last 28 years. In 28 years, our energy has, the carbon intensity of energy has decreased 2% in 28 years. About 0.1% per year. Next one. So if we look at something like coal, the green line, we can see this starting to kick down. But if we look at the green and the red, oil and gas, they're continuing to go up. So we have not reached the peak problem and starting to go down. The problem is still getting worse. Here's the problem. The theory is that we can adapt up to 2 and a bit degrees. And we can produce mitigation, cutting emissions down from 4 degrees back to 2. And this sweet spot where those two lines intersect is where we're going to go. But in fact, we have a different problem. We can't adapt to 2 degrees. And we're not mitigating down to 2. We're at 3. So we have this lovely hole in the middle, which may or may not be human civilization. So here are the sort of targets that would be necessary for 2 degrees of warming. The Paris commitments actually result in more emissions in 2030 than when the Paris Agreement was signed. But we need to go straight down. So that right angle between Paris and necessity is the political problem that we have today. Next one. So, in conclusion, it is now too late for gradual incremental steps to protect what we care about. Climate warming now is now a climate emergency which requires courageous leadership, which the previous speakers have all said. It requires coordinated actions implemented with thought and all possible speed and care. And my one-line summary, when you're about to go off a cliff, you don't need to slow the car, you actually need to turn it around really quickly. Professor Schellenhuber, who wrote a foreword for a report we put out a few weeks ago, there should be some words here. Climate change is now reaching, this is the guy who's the advisor to Pope Francis, the EU, and Angela Merkel, the most politically connected climate scientists in the world. Climate change is now reaching the end game where very soon humanity must choose between taking unprecedented action or accepting that it has been left too late and bear the consequences. There are 4 steps to this solution, and Kim started to talk about them in her talk. Stopping carbon dioxide emissions. Dealing with the short-lived gases like methane, which can actually help to bring warming down because they're not in the atmosphere for a long time. Thirdly, carbon drawdown or extraction to get it from 420 parts per million back to under half degree of warming, and then looking at other policy options to cool the planet if there's a clear and demonstrable benefit for doing so. We have the capacity. We have the economic and political capacity. After Pearl Harbor, the United States was transformed from the largest economy producing consumer goods, the largest economy producing military goods in a year. So if there's political will, there is certainly capacity. And we've seen that in all sorts of revolutions and things that have happened in our lifetime. Professor Stephan, who was the author of the Hothouse paper 4 weeks ago, says, getting greenhouse gas emissions down now fast has to be the primary target of political policy and economics with something like a wartime footing. And so let me just finish with these thoughts.
Thank you, David, for that talk. Probably the most frightening thing I read recently was I think I was in a cafe reading the Australian newspaper, which I don't buy, and it was in the business section, and they were talking about opportunities for mining in the Arctic now that there's not so much ice there. And I thought that it's not seen as a warning, it's actually seen as a commercial opportunity to get at all of the other resources. What do we do about this kind of thinking and about these kind of actions? I mean, it's bad enough already, but once that sort of thing starts to happen, that seems like a real end game.
We've got 2 days to answer that question. I'll give you a short answer. The quote I read from the national security people, last year we toured around a film called The Age of Consequences and showed it to some audiences, including some private business audiences in Sydney and Melbourne. And that shot of the fence around Bangladesh comes from that film. And I have to say, of all the things I've shown and all the presentations and ways people have tried to get to conservatives and business people, it's actually not the economic arguments that's going to change them. Every time we showed that film and we got the Bangladesh scene, you just had this go around the room. 150 people at the Lowy Institute. I mean, when we showed the film, I wait for the moment just to see how loud it's going to be. And I think what we learn from that is it is not just an economic argument we have to prosecute. It's actually an argument about existential risk, because what the Bangladesh story is telling you is that nations are going to come to an end, and that really changed. In my impression, that was great for those business audiences because they were really uncomfortable with it. They were right out of their zone. It wasn't money and interest rates. It was my children and my grandchildren are going to die in hell. And so that is the sort of thing, counterintuitively, that I think we should do more of. Certainly the discussion about national security, which I know it's got its problems, but to turn a discussion about national security into human security is a really good way to connect with those people, because when they see senior Pentagon people saying at 3 degrees the international system is going to break down, there will be outright chaos, that is a very sobering moment for them.
It is reassuring when business leaders are concerned about the collapse of civilisation. Natalie, up the back there, we've got a question. I'll get you to say your name if that's okay.
It's Jane, and I'm wondering if that film was screened in Canberra, and if not, why not?
Actually, a short version was shown on Four Corners. Whether they watched it or not, I don't know. They were probably having drinks and getting ready to see themselves on Q&A, but it did actually get national coverage.
John Carney, thanks for that presentation. I think I first started talking a little bit about climate change when I went to a meeting and they handed out a booklet on Let's Talk About Climate Change. And I think that a lot of people are scared about talking about climate change because they don't know what to do. And last year I attended a conference and met up with Angela and a few people out in Moonee Ponds area, and we go down and we talk to Bill Shorten. And I think that the important message is that book, Let's Talk About Climate Change, inspired me. And this conference, I think we've all got to talk to family and friends and one another and community. And thanks for your inspiration here. Thanks.
If Bill Shorten does adopt a climate emergency response, we're going to credit you with that. So, fantastic. Over here.
2 questions. Round trip efficiency on drawdown, and also what do you think about geo?
First question, there's a woman at Melbourne University, Kate Dooley's done a lot of work on drawdown, and a paper she put out came to one simple conclusion, that the most effective, viable, available solution now is the restoration of degraded forests. Because it doesn't require the water and the resources that reforestation does, and she's got figures talking about how many billion tonnes a year can be done. That should be the starting point across this movement. In terms of geoengineering, that is, should we put sulfates or something else in the atmosphere so it doesn't get so hot? As I said in my presentation, we shouldn't do it if it isn't safe and has a net positive benefit. But if we, as some people want to do, exclude thinking about it, we need to understand the costs of not thinking about it.
Paul Prentice. I think I may need 5 minutes to get through all I have to say. One of the things our speaker didn't mention about the thawing permafrost is the methane that it's producing, which is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and which we can't do anything about directly. So that's why we have to refreeze the permafrost. Another thing is the 1.6% per annum global emissions increase. I would have liked to have that mentioned as one of the indications that we are badly losing the race. Storage. Nobody talks about storage. Sun and wind only operate for about a third of the time, so you need heaps of storage to keep a steady supply going up. You have all these letters in the Australian saying, oh, what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? Storage is the answer, but people aren't talking about it. And the other thing is world population. That's a built-in driver of climate change, but nobody talks about that. Thank you.
The only thing I will say is 10% of the world's population is responsible for 90% of the emissions. So we shouldn't blame the 90%, we should blame ourselves.
Hi, Dick Gross. Fantastic presentation, I really liked it. I've seen a lot and that was great. I'm interested in two issues. A, how do you disseminate that to the smiling buffoons who take coal into our parliament? And secondly, I think despair is often the enemy of progress. So how do you get a pretty harsh message across without giving people a sense of hopelessness and despair?
I won't venture into the communications field because we have 2 or 3 sessions on that tomorrow morning. The debate about fear and hope, I think, is a bit of a silly one because well-grounded fear is why we're here as human beings today. If we weren't scared of mammoths, we would have died out a long time ago. So reason fear is a cause for hope. I think a better idea is to talk about courage rather than fear and hope, because that's where I think we are. I think we're at a particular moment in climate politics now because when Professor Will Steffen said what he said 4 weeks ago about this has got to be the first priority of government nationally, it's something he's never said before. When Professor Schellenhuber in the 4-hour report says it is dramatic action now or it's too late, there is a change in the conversation because people are realising the international policy-making process has and is failing. So while it seems difficult in one way, I think, and you'll see this in Europe in the next year, a very different conversation turn up at what needs to be done without stealing any of Paul's thunder.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking again David Spratt for a fantastic presentation.